32 ticks following, so they are swallowing. Monkey is swallowing. Snake self swallowing. Next, a swallow two will fly and come and swallow. You're ever swallow in a hollow gallow, making a whole lot of halabaloo. Jale Kalu, we know say you chop the money some, so give me the loot. Do you really want a revolution or just your turn?
Hello and welcome to Ake Books and Art Festival 2020 online. I'm Lamide Akintobi and I am so excited to be having this amazing book chat with Desmond Cole, who is the author of The Skin We're In, a best-selling book which was released in February 2020. And I'm so excited to have Desmond here to talk about all the things, that the book has in it, which is an amazing book. And so let's welcome Desmond Cole. So welcome, Desmond. And I guess my very first question to you is, how is pandemic year treating you?
Hi, Lamide, and thank you so much for doing this interview. It's really, really nice to be joining you. It's really hard. I don't know how to describe 2020. It's been wild. It's been a very, very bizarre year. I had been working on this book just over 4 years, actually, when 2020 began. And I was really looking forward to the book coming out at the start of 2020 and going on tour, which I did do starting in late January, early February of 2020. And I got about 6 weeks into the tour before we started hearing so much about coronavirus, and it just took over all the news headlines, everything. I remember I was actually on a tour stop in Kingston, Ontario. Mm-hmm. I was in a hotel room, and I turned on the TV and it was like a horror movie, like every channel, coronavirus, coronavirus, coronavirus. Yep. And I thought, well, I think things are going to change. And that was the last tour event that I did that day. I went home. It was rough. It was rough because I was feeling sorry for myself. I was so excited to be on tour. This is my first book and everything. And I felt like, oh man, I'm going to lose out on a lot of opportunities and stuff. And it took about 2 or 3 weeks for me to really appreciate what was happening and that this is global, that everybody was going through the same thing as me. I think once I realized that, it really put things into perspective. And I started just trying to figure out what life was going to be like, locked down at my apartment, mostly not going anywhere. And I would say the second major thing that has happened this year is, this huge resurgence of Black uprising in Canada and the United States as a result of the murder of George Floyd. That was a moment when Black people, I think, were like, okay, yes, we're living in a pandemic. Yes, things are dangerous and stuff, but we can't continue to live under these conditions where we're still being killed by the police, where we can't go outside. George Floyd was killed over allegedly trying to use a counterfeit $20 bill. Like, this is the value of a Black person's life to this day is $20. So I was also, part of that uprising. There was a woman here in Toronto named Regis Korchinski-Paquette who had the police called to her home. She was very clearly afraid when the police responded, and she tried to climb away from them on her balcony and fell to her death in Toronto. And there were tens of thousands of us. We went out into the street too, despite the lockdown. We marched for Regis too. And I think that's been the second major part of 2020 for me, is really seeing this necessary resurgence of Black engagement and activism. Because even during a pandemic, the ongoing crisis of white supremacy never went away.
For me, when I looked at just the blurb of your book before I even opened it up and started reading, I just felt like this is the perfect book for these times. And I think I'm trying not to gush too much because I really did love the book, but I cannot overstate how important it is. I think that I feel it is for everyone, not just Black people, because we know what's happening, right? So I wanted to talk to you first, before I go too far ahead of myself. I wanted to talk to you about the structure of the book. The Skin We're In takes a year in the life of Canada, 2017, and each chapter is a month. And then it's an issue, and I read a little bit about why you chose to do it, but just for the benefit of, those listening, I just wanted to ask you, why did you decide to pick that year? Why did you decide to structure the book that way?
Coming up with a structure was actually the hardest part of writing this book, because I had been asked to do it in 2015, actually. I wrote an essay called The Skin I'm In. And it was a personal essay about just my own experiences being stopped and documented by the police here in Toronto and the Greater Toronto area, and just experiences talking about how that impacted my life as a young person. And that piece did really, really, really well. And on the strength of that, I started being asked, would you like to write a book? And getting book offers. And I got an agent. And before I knew it, I had a book deal. But I really hadn't planned for all of that. And so I guess I was like really needing some time to step back and say, how do I want to do this? What do I want to say? How do I want to structure it? And I decided that I didn't want to write a book about myself. I wanted to write a book about like the experiences that Black communities in Canada are facing in general, because that's really what a lot of my journalism has tended to in the last several years. And it was in 2017 that I think I really started kind of figuring out what I wanted to do. And that's why the book takes place in that year, because I wanted, as a journalist, just like yourself, Lamide, I value what's happening around us right now. And I wanted to get that sense for the reader in the book that you're reading something that is not historical. We love putting Black experience in the past and saying, oh, remember back when Black people had their struggle. That's over now, right? And I didn't want to do that. So I wrote in the year that I was hoping to frame. And I got that idea basically of each chapter, each essay being 1 month of the year 2017, and picking an issue or an event from each month and framing the book around that. I was speaking with Dion Brand, who is one of our greatest living, Black writers in this country. I think she's one of the greatest, period. But I was fortunate enough to be having dinner with her and some other people. She said, how's your book going? I was very intimidated to have to answer this question to Dion Brand, but we started talking. I was kind of struggling with my ideas. I was all over the place at that time. And she just gave me some really good advice, because I was thinking more of taking a historical approach, like what I'm telling you, because I feel like as Black people, we always get pushed to like do all the work for people who don't know anything about our history. Yes. And so at first I was very inclined to try and go back 200, 300, 400 years of Canadian history. And Dion Brand said, you don't have to do that, though. Other people have done that. Other people are doing that. You're a journalist and an activist who's doing stuff right now. Write about what's happening for you right now. And through talking to her a little bit more and realizing, you just have to break a book down into little pieces, I just went home afterwards and I got this idea of like, I could tell a story per month. That's enough. Like, there's so many things that I could do with 1 month. And then I'll move to February, March, April. And that's how I ended up structuring the book. My editor, Martha Kenya Forstner, she and I came up with the idea for a 13th chapter at the same time to talk about two young people in Canada named Fatuma and Abdul Abdi. And so my year actually begins in January, and the last chapter of the book is January of 2018, to tell the incredible story of these two young Somali refugees to Canada and their struggle, but also to show that a year is not a neat and tidy container of Black life, that with the new year comes the same challenges, because we're fighting a structure. We're fighting systems of white supremacy, and they do not just go away or conform to our own cycles and our own timelines. So that was kind of how I came up with it.
Absolutely, and it was beautifully done. Okay, I think the first thing that I'll talk about as a theme that really spoke to me and I felt was beautifully illustrated in the book is the theme of sort of community. There's an identity. So there's a phrase in the book, and I'm paraphrasing, so please excuse me, when you talked about how racism became a shared experience between family, a family and collective experience. I believe that the phrase is something like that. And I wanted to talk to you about just that as a sort of continuous theme in the book, where you talk about the power of community, how we all, wherever we are, but in this case, in Canada, the people who are hurt, the Black people who are hurt, they get the support they need, they get the advocacy they need, they get the help they need through community, through other people who see, who see themselves in each other, coming together to say, you know what, this isn't right. And we have to support, we have to help. We are the ones that have to pull each other up. And again, as I say, it was beautifully illustrated. And I want to talk to you just a little bit about why you felt it was so important to highlight the way we have had to rally around each other and be the ones to rescue ourselves, over time.
It's a great question. I mean, I feel as though at first, as a child, the first challenge is that you don't understand what racism is. I didn't understand what racism is. And even into my adult years, I would never use a term like white supremacy, for example. So I think what that shows is that when we're first trying to understand racism, we think of it, I think, very often on an individual level. We think that this is something that is happening to us personally, and it feels very isolating. And I certainly, some of the stories that I tell in the first chapter of the book about being a child and just kind of waking up to, oh, this is what racism is. And you start having experiences and you go and you talk to your parents about it. And my parents were always very open when I would talk to them about things, about like listening and saying, okay, well, what do you think is going on? But I didn't understand. I really, really didn't understand. And as I got older, I think you start realizing that this is true and you don't want to understand because you're like, oh my God, if this is true, if the world is really looking at us as Black people like this, if my country, Canada, is really looking at me as a Black person like this, that's horrible. And you don't want to believe it. When your parents tell you as a child that in a white country, you're going to have to be twice as good in order to get what your white friends are getting, in order to see the opportunities and everything. You don't want to hear it. I personally did not want to hear it, Lamide, right? I was just like, no, that's negative, that's cynical. I found a lot of comfort as time went on in actually being able to talk to other people in my family and outside of my family who were having similar experiences, to start reading books where people are documenting real or fictional experiences of anti-Black racism. That took away a lot of the shame, I guess, that I felt as a child of feeling like I was different. Now, I am not different, I'm African. And in this part of the world, people say all kinds of weird stuff about, oh yeah, people who are different. What do you mean different? You mean not white? That was a source of shame when I started to recognize, oh, you're not white, you're not like these white people all around you. I grew up, I mean, I'm in my mom's house today. I went to school in this town. This is an extremely white place, Oshawa, Ontario, that I grew up. But I started as I got older to see my Blackness as a strength, to see it as an asset, and to see the community of Blackness that I started to discover, especially once I moved to Toronto, that was actually what I wanted, that I actually wanted to feel that and experience that. I wanted to revel in all of the cultural things that we share as Black people that other people do not understand, our language, our food, our humor, right? And sharing that across, by the way, the diaspora, because there are so many different Black people here in Canada, and we don't all come from the same place, but yet there's so much shared culture amongst all of us. And so I guess that whole wanting to celebrate community came slowly for me. It came in degrees. And now it's just an inescapable part of who I am, and I'm celebrating it. Whereas before, I think I was shamed by my culture and my country to not want to be proud.
Right, absolutely. Wow. And I love the line of, people who can understand without explanation. That's us. We get it. You don't have to, what's not seen. Yeah, we get it. We're here. Absolutely. So, I mean, there's so many things I want to kind of touch on, and I don't want to go way too far, but you mentioned, you're in your mom's house, and you mentioned family, you mentioned background. And so I wanted to go to the African factor, where Ake, and the theme this year is African time. You are, your parents are Sierra Leonean. There's this, I feel like sometimes there's this thing about, when you're first generation, anything, American or Canadian or Brit, there's this thing where the older generation generation and the younger generation have a bit of a disconnect in the way that we deal with things. And I feel like that was also illustrated in the book in the first chapter, where you talked about meeting a young Tanzanian, girl at a protest. And she said, I've been through oppression. I'm not going to come to a new place and still be oppressed and ignore it. And then you have like the end of the book where you talk about being at the federal summit, the Canadian summit, and you're being tone policed, by an older, Black woman there. And you mentioned also, a part in the book where, you went out for a walk when you were visiting your mom, and then you come back and she's like, where were you at? And you're like, oh, I went for a walk. And she's like, you went walking in the dark, and there's this sort of disconnect sometimes where it's almost like the older generation, they get where they are and they've escaped something. And so they want the younger generation to kind of toe the line a little bit. And I wanted to talk about this generational disconnect, how you talked about it in the book, and how you feel about it, and the discussions you've had about it since the book has come out with your family members or with, just other people from different generations about how they felt about your writing and how they felt about the truths that you put forth in the book.
This is such a good question. Obviously, when we talk about generational differences, we're generalizing to some extent, right? Because we can't say the same thing for everybody of a certain age, just like we can't say the same thing for anybody of any category.
Absolutely.
But I definitely do know, and I think, people my age who are first generation Canadian, we will tell you that there's a certain common experience to many of us that has to do, I think, with our expectations of this Canadian system versus what our parents were. And I think one of the really big differences is that because my parents had to immigrate here from Sierra Leone, there's very much this notion that Canada embraced them to some extent. Canada accepted them to some extent. I never had to go through that because I was born here. And so my expectations about my country are that acceptance is not good enough for me. I'm Canadian. Why should I stop at acceptance or start at acceptance when this is mine as much as it's anybody else's, right? And so I think that another component of that generational gap, though, is that I really cannot appreciate the sacrifices that my family had to make in order for me to be able to be sitting here talking to you and having the life that I have. My book is dedicated to my maternal grandmother, who passed many years ago, but is still somebody I think about all the time and who really is a true inspiration for me and lived a wonderful life while she was alive. But when she came to this country, she was cleaning hotel rooms as an older woman because she needed to try and qualify to get some, federal assistance. My mom and dad both went back to school as adults. They both worked minimum wage jobs in order to just try and survive, figured out ways to support us while we went to school. It was really, really hard for them. And I know that there are so many ways that my parents, my grandparents, my uncle and aunt, I can't appreciate them having to start over in those ways. They learned how to keep their heads down when they were experiencing the racism that they did experience.
Yeah.
They learned how to bite their tongue, how to manage to get through, because especially I think 40 years ago in this country when my parents were first here, it was a lot less safe to speak out. It was a lot less possible. There were fewer of us. The culture and the climate and the times were different. And that's not to say that people were not speaking out and fighting back then. Of course they were. And even in my own family. But I think that we're standing on their shoulders.
Absolutely.
And so there's maybe a sense that we're less grateful or that we are not seizing as many of the opportunities. But again, I know that these are huge generalizations. One thing I do want to say that I do think in general that the older generation may not appreciate is despite all the incredible hard work that they put in and despite all of the barriers that they crashed through, the opportunities for all people of my generation, I'm 38 years old, the opportunities for me with my education and my level of work experience are not there the way that they were for my parents' generation in this country. The wages haven't gone anywhere. The growth, economic growth hasn't gone anywhere. The opportunities are not there. We're still bringing in Black people from the Caribbean and from Africa to come and work minimum wage jobs in this country when they have huge education, huge credentials, huge work experience. We're still exploiting Black people's labor in Canada so that we don't have to give them an opportunity to compete and to live the life that they are owed. So I think our parents' generation must look at some of us in our late 30s or older, and we don't own property. You know, we're not married in many cases. We do not have children as early or at all. And
Right.
because of an economic reality in my country that is holding a whole generation of people back, while the generation that my parents belong to are, and forgive me for saying it, but I have to, they're hoarding everything, the baby boomer generation, they're hoarding everything that they were given an opportunity to earn and really trying to prevent the next generation of people from coming up behind them.
I think about, Nigeria, and I think about, parts in your book where you talk about, white supremacy as basically as an inheritance, right, from colonialism, from colonial masters. And a lot of countries in Africa have, they were colonized, so we had colonial masters. And I think about it, and I think about there are parallels to, even though we don't have, like in Canada or in the US, and I know you hate those comparisons, but we don't have, for example, the settlers and then the Black people. Like, we're all Black in Nigeria. We have parallels in the sense that we inherited some things, mentalities, systems, attitudes from the colonial masters that are still here today. So even though we don't have them lording it over us physically, in person, I don't know, we have this authority in place that we can't seem to get past it. And it might be that hoarding of that you mentioned, but it's definitely something that I thought about when reading your book. Every single time I came across, that line and talking about colonialism and, like what's left over from colonial times, I just thought, oh, Nigeria, we have that sort of parallel as well. I wanted to talk a little bit something about just what you said now in terms of, the resources and people who are still coming in from Africa, from the Caribbean. You also talked about Haiti in your book. The people who are coming in droves to Canada because they see Canada as this utopia, this place where, oh, it's just so much better than the US, especially in the last few years. Can we talk about that? Because I know that's something that you have talked about, and you just think to yourself, I know that you really, really do not like those comparisons, and you don't think that they should be benchmarked at all. So let's talk about that. Why do you hate the comparison so much?
I really do not like these Canada versus the US comparisons, because something that I have really learned about anti-Blackness is that one of the really big defining features of anti-Blackness that I see is this way of telling Black people not to have too many expectations,
right,
to feel fortunate if we get anything. And so comparing Canada to the United States, which is presumed to be the worst country in the world for Black people, in some ways anyway, especially with police violence, I think the United States is kind of conjured up as like, that's the worst place you can be in terms of facing state violence as a Black person. The jail and prison system, all the rest of it, their horrible education system, on and on and on and on. And I hate that comparison, because if we start there and we say, okay, America's clearly the worst, that means anything that's not there is better. And I just want to know as a Black person why that's supposed to be good enough for me, why I'm supposed to celebrate anything that's not the bottom of the barrel. Like, that's not good enough for me, and it's not good enough for our people. So I don't like that starting point that says America is just worse, and so we should be grateful no matter what our conditions are here. Because what that gives my country is it gives my country an excuse never to examine itself. It says we get a pass because somewhere else Black people are being treated even worse. So it's not that we're good. It's that somebody else is worse off, and that's how we measure Black people's success. And I just think that that's deeply insulting. But beyond that, when you actually start looking at what happens in Canada, despite all of the rosy, we're excellent with our marketing. Can I say that? Canadians, white Canada has perfected a certain kind of marketing vis-a-vis the United States, right? That comparison kind of thing that says we're the friendlier, nicer. And I would love people to pause for a second and say, what would it be that would make this white settler colonial country so benevolent? If we just like remove ourselves from the mythology for 1 second, why would a country also founded on the genocide of Indigenous peoples here in Canada, also founded on the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery for hundreds of years? People do not know our history in this country. That is part of the reason I wanted to write the book. Why would a country founded on those exact same ideas as the United States, from the same mother country, England, be so benevolent and loving towards Black people? Like, what? Why? It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And so when you start looking at it, what do you see? You see that in Canada, there are 3 times as many Black people, in the federal prison system as there are in the general population. So that sounds like it could be an American stat, but that's Canada. In Canada, in the city that I live in now, in Toronto, the largest city in the country, the most Black populated city in the country, a Black person is 20 times more likely to be shot and killed by a Toronto police officer than a white person. 20.
Wow.
So if it were 30 in America, should I be counting my blessings and being grateful? Like, what is it that we're saying that we should be so happy about in this country when that's the reality? The number of, so you mentioned Haiti and Haitian people. Canada, the history of Canada's interference in Haiti is so long and so important to understand, but we have contributed to so much suffering and political instability in Haiti. And then when people leave that island and they come to the United States or they come to Canada, they're mistreated once again. Right now, in the middle of a global pandemic, we've had, so in the last 3 years, a lot of Haitian people have come here leaving the United States. And I think that this is a really good example of my point, because why are they leaving America? Well, we will not name the president of the United States today, but everybody knows who we're talking about. When he came into office, he said, no more protected status for Haitians. You've been living in America with a temporary visa, I'm canceling it. You're not going to be protected here anymore. And when Haitians heard that, thousands of them decided to come to the Canadian border. And by the way, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, told people, if you are fleeing violence, if you're fleeing war, if you're fleeing persecution, come to Canada and you will be welcomed here. So thousands of Haitians on foot came through New York State up to Quebec and crossed into Canada. And they were all arrested. It's one of the largest mass arrests in Canadian history, maybe the largest. And they were put into the queue for asylum hearings, the vast majority of which that have been processed anyway are being denied. And so while Haitians now moved from America with no status to Canada with no status, facing deportation from ICE officials in America to facing deportation from Canada Border Services Agency in Canada. Do you know what they're doing right now? Hundreds of them are working in Montreal, Quebec, in our long-term care homes. They have no status, and they are working in some of the most dangerous jobs, taking care of people who are sick with COVID-19. And the Haitian community in Montreal has experienced a severe outbreak of COVID-19 as a result of their work.
Wow.
So they are able to come and sacrifice for this country and risk their very lives, but
Yeah.
there's no status, there are no protections, and there's deportation looming for all of these people. So this is the contrast that people really don't want to look into, that says that Canada is so much better. I think that getting the opportunity to be deported from Canada is not that much better than having the opportunity to be deported from the United States. And if our prime minister was welcoming Black people here, he would be giving them status.
Wow. Yeah, that's super heavy. I mean, since the book has, been out and you've been having discussions, about it and other book chats and, done some press, be it virtually, do you feel like some of the people who should know this stuff and didn't know this stuff now know this stuff and the scales are kind of falling from people's eyes? Do you feel like there's been at least, deeper discussions, more awareness brought about? Because as I mentioned earlier, like, we know what's happening, but when we talk about things like white fragility, maintaining status quo and dominator culture, which is something that you also mentioned in your book, the people who should be aware of these things, they're not always aware of them. So do you feel like there's been any kind of shift? Has there been any, have you observed anything where you feel like people are actually waking up to what's happening in Canada?
I think it's undeniable that something new is happening right now. No question. See in the news that we are talking about systemic racism and that public officials are being asked to answer for the way that racism operates in Canada on a systemic level rather than just an individual level, I think huge. And it's very hard to get there because, a very, very famous thing happened almost exactly a year ago. I've just been working on a piece about it, but it was almost exactly a year ago that and images of our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in blackface came out into the media and were sent around the world. And the thing about that happening a year ago was that it was in the middle of an election campaign.
Right.
So it, once again, that dynamic that I'm talking about where racism gets reduced down to the individual, that is what happened with Justin Trudeau. And it was an argument about, is he sorry? Is he a good person? Should we forgive him? Has he learned his lesson? And that's not really the conversation that we need to be having. The conversation we need to be having beyond this personal exhibition of racism is, what is Justin Trudeau's government doing or not doing for Black people in Canada, for Indigenous people and other people of color in Canada? And now with this resurgence since the murder of George Floyd, we're having finally more conversations that I have not seen before about, why do we give so much of our money to the police in this country? Okay. Why do we give so much money to child welfare services who have such a horrific colonial history in this country of taking Indigenous children away from their families on purpose, of being designed, essentially. Our child welfare system was conceived of because white settlers were thinking to themselves, there are too many Indigenous people, they speak their own languages, they have their own traditions, and it's hard to dominate them with that in place. So let's actually create a system that removes the children from their parents for the purposes of education. We'll put them in these schools away from their families, and then they'll lose their language, they'll lose their culture, they'll lose their way of life, and they will become like us, and they won't have any resistance to our culture anymore. Wow. Well, there are more Indigenous children in Canada's child welfare system today than there were at the height of the residential school system. And now Black children are being en masse apprehended and taken away from their Black parents and Black caregivers and put into the custody of the state. We are having more conversations today about these things than ever before, and it's because of decades and really centuries of struggle by Black people to get us there. I will say, though, that as much as I'm happy that we're getting to these newer moments of recognition, that this is not about a personal recognition for Canada's white majority. We're not on a quest to get white Canadians to be like, oh, I understand now. You know, I didn't get it before, Desmond, but now I understand. Understanding is not good enough. What are you doing?
Yeah.
Where are the resources going?
Yeah.
When we spend 1/10 of every dollar in Toronto on police, but our schools don't have food programs. There's no childcare in Toronto. What are we actually doing with this understanding that police is violence, that the child welfare system is violence, that our so-called criminal justice system, which puts all of these Black and Indigenous people in jail, is a form of violence? Until we're ready to dismantle those systems, all of the kind of awakenings of white folks are not going to save us, unfortunately. So that's I think where we need to get to next is a point where people are willing to take risks to make what they know and they say that they understand a reality.
Right. Wow. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I love that answer. And I wanted to talk about, you talked about it's good that mainstream media is talking about systemic racism and, crimes basically being committed against Black people, Indigenous people in Canada. And I want to talk about mainstream media and social media post your book being released, right? A lot of things have happened since February. This pandemic year has been like 20 years in one. First of all, it's like too much going on. But since February, we've talked about the murder of George Floyd. We've talked about, there's also so many other deaths that have happened that have just, touched everyone around the world. And you say, there was obviously things that happened as well in Canada that you've been, on the streets and protesting for. I wanted to talk about how the mainstream media in Canada, post BLM taken to the streets, BLM Toronto taken to the streets, has sort of handled these topics, right? Do you feel like there's more nuance, or do you feel kind of like social media is doing a better job of telling these stories? Because I think we're in a weird moment in time where social media is a place where a lot of us younger people kind of go to vent, to see what's really truly going on, because we've lost a little bit of trust in mainstream media. Do you feel that way? And what do you see as what's happening really in your thoughts of like what's the truth of that?
I've been working in journalism for 10 years. In my 10 years of doing this, I would say that in many ways, the Canadian mainstream media has gotten worse. It's unbelievable how much resistance there is to having the conversations that I'm talking about. And it's only happening more now because those of us in media spaces who are Black, who are Indigenous, who are other people of color, we're forcing the issue and we're refusing to take no for an answer. And we're making those sacrifices and taking those risks that I'm talking about in order to try and move the conversation and get some action happening. In our mainstream media culture here in Canada, what we've been doing in order to stall this conversation is to say, is there racism in Canada? So that was the first several years of my career, is just looking at racism right in its face and asking, is it racism? As a stalling tactic. Now, we've now graduated from that in Canada to now what we do is we say, there's racism here too. I'll have you know there's racism in Canada as well. And we don't quantify where it is. And usually what that does is like, it's not like there's racism in the media, for example. It's like there's racism floating in the air somewhere undetectable. And we just have to acknowledge that it's floating in the air. But I'm not doing it. I'm not participating in it. It's just out there somewhere.
In the ether.
In the ether, exactly. But now what we've got are individuals, particularly Black individuals and Black women in Canadian media, really leading the way and taking a lot of risks and saying, well, I'm not going to operate in this racist climate the way that I was before. And if you, as my organization that I work for, are not going to support me, then yeah, I'm going to go on social media. I'm going to say the things that need to be said. I think we were talking about Kayla Gray, one of our excellent sportscasters, Black women sportscasters here in Canada who has been really, really taking a lot of risks lately in order to call out racism, in order to correct and challenge some of the biases within our own industry. And as a
Right.
Black person, every time you do that, you're risking your career, period. Because it's still not safe to tell what's true in Canadian media and in Canadian culture without paying the price for it as a Black person. Social media is indispensable because it allows us to speak directly to our audiences. It allows us to speak to other Black people who are going through what we're going through. And when we see things that the mainstream isn't covering or isn't correcting or isn't challenging, we can call them out on social media and say, why?
Yeah.
Looks like you missed something here. Looks like you forgot to do this or to talk about that. And I think that that's very embarrassing because the younger generation of Black people are too savvy on social media, and we whoop these people in the mainstream every time. Like they can't keep up with us. You know, I'll give a really simple example. I was watching a basketball game myself a couple of weeks ago. I was watching a Toronto Raptors game, and one of our white sportscasters who was covering the game, and remember, this is in the middle of players wearing Black Lives Matter back of their jersey and demonstrating against police brutality. In the middle of calling the game, this sportscaster, Leo Routens, made a comment about how some aspect of the game seems like, you know, you have a noose around you and the noose is holding you back.
A noose.
A noose. He said that, and I was like watching TV at home at night, and I'm like, did I just hear that? Like, am I imagining that he just said noose? What is going on? And when I called this out on social media, on Twitter, Routens himself actually saw my comment and responded, and he was like, oh, but I wasn't talking about the kind of noose that goes around your neck. I was talking about the kind of noose that, you know, just holds you back from doing something. And he was like, come on, man. That was his comment to me, was come on, man. And I was just like, this is incredible. But do you know something? I knew it was going to happen, and it did. Within 24 hours, Leo Routens was back on social media again, apologizing for using that word. Now, he never said anything to me, Lamide. He never said, you know, you were right to call me out yesterday and I was defensive. He got like 13,000 likes on the tweet where he apologized and said that his intentions were this and that, and spent the whole day celebrating himself with people who were like, it's okay, Leo, you're a good guy. Don't worry about Leo. We know it's in your heart. And he never even was like, yeah, Desmond, you know, you took a risk to point out to me that that was a messed up thing to say. Thank you. So that's the state of Canadian media in this country, is that like we still have to be the ones to put ourselves on the line. And thankfully for our country, we are willing to do that because we are the ones that are driving any change that's happening.
Absolutely. I want to talk about, I want to say, because I don't have it right in front of me, the month of May in your book. And it was the chapter where you where, you know, you had your feet in water. It was I feel like it was a chapter of rest in a sense. It was the shortest chapter in the book. And I wanted to ask you why you put that chapter there. Like, why did you feel like you needed a chapter that was maybe not as heavy, you know, as the others?
Yeah, well, I mean, anybody who knows my work knows that I do tend to get into a lot of heavy subject matter. That's just what I am interested in. And I wrote the book in order. So I started in January 2017, and I wrote in sequence. And the April chapter of the book was personal. I talked about what we were just talking about, really, was my own struggles in journalism and having to leave the most high-profile journalism job that I ever had at the Toronto Star because the newspaper didn't like that I demonstrated in a public protest on my own time. And even though I was only writing there twice a month, they seemed to believe that they owned me and could tell me what I'm allowed to do and what was proper to do in my own time. So they gave me a big ultimatum, and I had to leave. Instead of trying to continue surviving in that environment, I quit. and it sucked. It was horrible. I was depressed. I was confused. I was angry. And after reliving that by writing about it for the book, I just went to a bad place. And I told my editor, Martha, I don't know how to keep going right now. Like, I'm just depleted. And I essentially turned the next chapter of the book, which I was like, I don't even know where to go with this right now. I almost wrote a journal entry.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about other things that didn't make me feel so bad.
Yeah.
I started thinking about like May as the springtime month. You know, I started thinking about how it makes me feel to be able to go outside and to see things blooming again, and to, put your feet in the water for the first time of the new year because it's warm enough to do so. We have way too much winter in this country. And, you know, that got me going and imagining and like thinking about other things. Like I'm sitting here speaking to you at the dining room table in my mother's house, and for years there was a lilac bush in the backyard that my mom would cut the blossoms and put them right here on the table. And so you come inside in the springtime and you smell this wonderful spring. I started getting all those associations, birds, nature, and just like having a moment of appreciation and writing about it. And it felt so good. It was such a departure from everything else that I had been talking about, which was difficult. I wrote it in one day, and it became the 5th chapter of the book. You know, I don't apologize that a lot of the work I do is hard, because being Black, being in this skin in this country is also hard. There are ways to celebrate, and there are ways to acknowledge and to take time and to appreciate our humanity and to appreciate just the gift of being here, even though things can be really, really hard. And so I wanted to give a tribute in that chapter also to like the people in my life, my mom, my family, and my friends, who give more meaning, right, beyond all of the really difficult things that we struggle through, or help support me through all of those difficult things. And once I had done that, it was a little easier to continue writing.
I think when I opened it up, it was almost like I read. And when I got to May and I read May, I took a deep breath and I was like, everything's going to be all right. So it definitely came across in the pages. And I felt you needed that, you know, that moment, that time to just kind of be Desmond and not just be, you know, the wake worker, which is one of the, I love that phrase, by the way, that you use in the book.
Sure. Yes.
Wake worker. I love that. So I want to talk about family and your book. You know, your heritage, as I mentioned before, is Sierra Leonean. And, you know, you said that, you know, you were able to talk about it, you know, when you were in school and you kind of got older and understood what racism was, why you were, you know, called from the back to come to sit in the front of the class and put, you know, out of sight. And, you know, just little things that made you aware of your difference, you know, as a young person, and you're able to come home and talk to your family about that. And I want to talk to you, like, when the book came out, or in the process of writing the book, if you were talking to them about it, what were the kind of discussion, but like, what were the things that I guess the book may have unearthed that you may have had new discussions about, or deeper discussions about, you know, once the book was, I guess, in the works, or once it was released? I
was trying very hard not to talk too much about the contents of the book while I was writing it. It's funny because I remember when I started writing the book, people would say, "Oh, can you tell me what it's about, or is that a secret?" And I would always happily tell them what the book was about, but I never wanted to share too much of the actual contents. And that includes with like people close to me and even like my family members. However, I think one of the more interesting aspects of writing this book and researching for it was just really learning more about the connection within my own family to colonialism, and how colonialism shaped the Black presence here in Canada. Because if anybody knows about Sierra Leone, They know that it is itself a British colony.
Yes.
And they know that it is a place where millions of our people were stolen and forced onto ships and sent away from places like Bunce Island.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them didn't even make the trip here. There's no way to know for sure, but we've read many historical analyses that suggest that as many or more people died during the Middle Passage than made it here safely.
Yeah.
It's beyond description, and that's the thing, is that the work of people like Christina Sharp, you just mentioned Wake Work, the work of people who, Saidiya Hartman and others, who think about what it means to have survived that and to still be here in what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery. It is incomprehensible that we even survived as Black people. But then the history is so rich because the large Canadian presence of Black people comes when the British and the Americans are fighting each other. And as a tool of undermining the Americans, the British tell enslaved Black people, fight on our side, fight with us. And if we win, when we win, we're going to bring you up to our place, and there's lots of land, and you'll be free, and you can exercise your rights. And that was how the British convinced thousands of what were called Black loyalists to turn against their American captors, fight in that Revolutionary War, and come up to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
It was then British North America, but the same idea. And of course, the British were lying to the Black folks who fought with them because they didn't give them any land, at least not any of the kind of land that would allow them to survive and farm and be self-sustaining. They gave them the worst, rockiest parts of the land in what is now Nova Scotia. And in the places where Black people tried to live in proximity with white settlers, the white settlers revolted, burned their houses, made laws prohibiting them from being able to go outside or socialize or drink in public or dance in public. The first chapter of my book is called Negro Frolics, because there was a law in 1780s Nova Scotia saying that Negro frolics, Black people dancing, Black people drinking, Black people gambling, was illegal. And after having to endure all these kinds of violences, and after facing resentment from white settlers who were, of course, themselves stealing that land from Indigenous people, from Mi'kmaq people, Black people who had come up and thought that they were going to be free were like, you know what? We don't want this. We don't want to be here. This is not what we were offered. This is not what we were promised. And we want to get out of here.
Yeah.
Many of those Black loyalists got on ships and they sailed to what is now a place called Freetown, the capital city of Sierra Leone, where my family hails from. I get tingly and shivery just talking about it and thinking about what that means, and having a little bit of a reflection into my own ancestry. That's been a really cool thing to talk about with my family, and to think about with our family, and to look in old books and to look at the names of some of those people who were Black loyalists, who are like names in my family: Johnson, Davies, Hamilton, Cole. It's a window into who we are and where we might have come from, because the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery took so much of our history away from us.
Absolutely. The tracing back is so, when I read that part, I just thought to myself, oh my goodness, I can't imagine how you must have felt, like in real time, connecting those dots, What have been some of the most gratifying moments for you, just since February?
Getting to do something like this with you from West Africa, and speaking to you in Nigeria, and having people read and really take in, as it's obvious that you did. And I'm so grateful, Lamide, for that. Like, thank you. That part is really wonderful. Like at the beginning of the tour that I did is just like pure excitement, right? Going out into the world. People are buying the book. They haven't even read it yet, but like they want to. And that was awesome. And I was on a high, and you're meeting so many people, and like things like handshakes and hugs, which I so took for granted at the beginning of 2020.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, if I had only known. But that part was amazing. But now that more time has gone by and more people have actually been able to sit down with the text and read it, hearing people say this part was influential for me because of this reason is really gratifying. This part of the book made me recognize something in my own life or think about it in a different way. The responses, particularly from Black people, about what connects for them in this book, like seeing that has been extremely, extremely gratifying. And also, I'm not gonna lie, this being for many months now the #1 best-selling nonfiction book in the country, I never thought that was gonna happen. It is so significant for me because I have never had a full-time job in Canadian media.
My mind was blown when I read. I was like, "What?" I could not believe that. I was like, as we say in Nigeria, what? Tight. I was like, whoa. Yeah, continue. Sorry.
But like, this is the reality of speaking the truth. So when I speak about Kayla Gray, and when I think about other people in our industry who have been, especially in the last few months, taking risks to expose racist conditions inside of our media, you don't just, receive no favors for doing that. You get held back, and people say, well, I don't want that person in my shop. I don't want to work with that person. That person's going to be calling me racist next. And so I can stand at a distance and I can applaud that person and I can say, oh, they do great work, but they're not getting anywhere near our operation. Honestly, it's taken me a lot of time to get myself to a point where I don't actually want to be a full-time employee in mainstream Canadian media anymore, because this book liberated me. This book was like me being able to say all the things that industry would not let me say, and then having a success for it. So now I'm good. Like, I'm going to continue doing my own thing independent. I don't need y'all anymore. Like, I'm done with y'all. Like, thank you very much. We tried. We're done. I'm out. If you liked it, you should have put a ring on it. All that. So it feels good. It feels really, really good that this book is hitting and connecting with my community and with other people who are curious and want to learn about this incredible resurgence. We haven't talked much about Black Lives Matter Toronto.
Yeah.
And, I am so fortunate that I was coming up doing this work at the same time that organization started in our city.
Yeah.
And really just were pushing for politicians and for community and social leaders, for our education system, pushing to say, whatever you're doing right now is not good enough for us. And we're tired of waiting. We're tired of consulting. We're tired of the reports. And Black Lives Matter Toronto, in my own city anyway, right across the country and beyond, they've just had a tremendous, tremendous impact and opened up a space for a lot of us who work to be able to speak more loudly.
With everything that's going on with the resurgence, as you mentioned, with this your liberation, which I love that you're liberated. Like, what's exciting you now? What's the work that is making you, ready to jump up in the morning and, get ready to go and all that kind of stuff, pandemic notwithstanding? What's the joy in your bones right now?
Like I said, being #1 is nice, and I celebrate that all the time. I mean, okay, so this is like a little bit of a weird technicality, but we have different book lists in this country of like who's #1. So I just stick with the one that says I am. So like,
Let's go with that. No, I'm on board.
Every week I check that one list and I'm like, am I still #1 on this list? Okay, good. Keep it moving. And that's that. But like, I am really excited to to get back to actually writing. I haven't been doing a lot of writing in 2020. I've been doing a lot of promotion and a lot of this kind of stuff. And I love it because that's how I continue getting my book out into the world. But I really want to get back to writing. I've been speaking with a couple of my really close friends about starting a little bit of a website where we, like I said, in this independent fashion, just start putting out our own stuff about Black life and Black existence and resistance and art and culture and humor and jokes in Canada, and find a real home for that. So a little sneak preview, that should be coming very soon.
Okay.
It's a website, and I think we're going to be calling it Yes Everything. I don't think I've ever said that publicly, so this is the first time I'm telling anybody. That gets me really excited.
Yeah.
And, you know, the movement to challenge police authority in this country has really, really, more than anything, it has really benefited from this latest push of activism. And we're talking more now realistically about why our municipal and provincial and federal police budgets are what they are, why we are sending a police officer with a gun to a noise complaint, to an instance of somebody in mental health crisis.
Right.
We're starting to question that in a way that I have never seen before. And I'm very excited to continue pushing the momentum, because right now we are, we're talking about defunding police. Like, should we take away some of their money?
Yeah.
And I'm like, we're getting there, guys. We're getting there. We're getting there. Because if I have the right to kill you and you take away my fancy uniform and my gun and you just leave me with a club, I still have the legal right to kill you.
Right.
You can defund a killer, but it doesn't stop them from being a killer. And the police is a killer system that needs to actually be dismantled. And so moving from a space where we say, let's give them a tap on the hand and maybe take away some of their money, to saying, no, let's actually reorganize what we think of as law enforcement and safety.
Yeah.
Let's send people with de-escalation training to mental health crises. Let's deal with issues like domestic violence inside of our communities so that we don't have to call the police. These are the conversations that are like giving me more energy now, because we're actually starting to have them more often. And I think that's really good.
That's awesome. That sounds so good. Is that going to be the topic of the next book? Like, are you ready to write another book, or are you just like,
no, I was
everything for now, and then, you know?
It took me the better part of 5 years to write one. I'm like, let me enjoy this. Like,
I'll ask you this question again in a couple years.
It's been such a good experience, though, that don't be surprised. It's probably going to happen in its own time. You know, this book happened in its own time, and I'm so grateful to Doubleday, to my editor Martha Kenya Forstner, to my publicist, to my agent Jackie Kaiser. People have really supported me to do this work in the time that I needed to do it.
Yeah.
And, you know, God willing, when the next time comes, I will be having this conversation with you again, if not sooner.
Okay, awesome. That sounds great. And before I say goodbye, I don't want this conversation to end, but is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would like to say?
No, I mean, we've been able to talk about so much, but I do want to say how cool it is to be part of Ake Festival, really, and to be connecting back with the continent and with West Africa. If things had been a little different this year, maybe I would have actually been sitting there with you having this conversation. But I hope that can happen in the future. And I just want to say thank you to Lola and to everybody at Ake Festival for your work in like transitioning this to an online format that we could all, you know, participate in. And I hope to do it again. I really do. I'm very, very grateful. And to you, Lamide, for like reading and thinking through and caring about this book.
No, thank you for writing such a beautiful book. I honestly, I really, really, really loved reading it. I enjoyed it completely. And, thank you for your time to, and just, carving out some time to talk to us, because I know that there's so much that you're doing and so much of it is such important work. So all the best with, moving the work forward. And I look forward to Yes Everything. I look forward to hearing much more about all the things that you're doing. I'll definitely be keeping tabs, and hopefully the next time we have Ake, you'll be here in Nigeria, pandemic go away. And, we'll be able to see the sights and sounds of Nigeria, with having you here as well.
I would really love that. Thank you so much.
Awesome. So one last thing before we say a final goodbye, is wanted to ask you to read a little part. I don't know if you have a favorite part of the book. If you could read one part of the book. I almost feel like I really, really loved the last chapter. I liked, the story of Asha Abdi. I don't know if that's too long, but if you want, whichever part you feel like you would like to read. If you want to read from May, that would be great too, because I feel like that's beautiful. That's our deep breath and Busa moment,
Yeah. May is short though, so I don't know if I'm going to give May away.
Okay.
But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll read you from April.
Okay.
Talking about my experiences with the Toronto Star. I'll read
By
this.
the way, I was incensed on you. I was like, he took you to lunch to give you what? But anyway, I was hurt on your behalf. I said, you know what?
Don't give that part away. We're gonna let them read it and find out. But I'll read you the beginning of that chapter. Direct action, April. When I was young, I loved to write for myself. I wrote stories and poems and kept a journal. I always imagined that if I ever wrote anything for others to read, it would be fiction. I never dreamed of writing for a newspaper, and I never thought, after getting a job with one of the biggest in Canada, that I'd ultimately walk away from it. I wrote my last piece as a columnist with the Toronto Star on April 12, 2017. The circumstances made it easier to quit. I had started off with a weekly column, but by the time I quit, my column had been reduced to every 2 weeks. I had no contract, no membership in the union, no benefits, no apparent prospects for advancement in the company. The president of the board of directors had suggested I write less about race issues, and I'd just been advised that I had violated the paper's code of conduct by staging a sit-in at a meeting of the Toronto Police Oversight Board. My demonstration at the police board was in response to police carding, a racist surveillance practice the Star has devoted an impressive amount of time and resources to documenting over the last 2 decades. My editor at the newspaper said I had broken company rules by engaging in public protest and told me I needed to choose between my column and my activism, to restrict my Black struggle for the privilege of writing for the paper twice a month. Shit, I didn't even have a dental plan. I'll stop there.
Awesome. That's a perfect place to stop. It's been so great talking to you. Thank you once again for your time. And yes, just thank you for your beautiful book.
Thank you so much. Hello and goodbye to everybody in Lagos. Hello to everybody at Ake Festival. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
If you ever need a new place to go, you can join me in a world of words. Many seems like I'm nowhere to be found. If you look, you'll find me in a book. Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon. You'll never be alone. Now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the word in a book. You'll never be alone. Now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the word in a book. words.